Welcome back to the security stream, everybody. My name's Jamie Pease. Most of you I can see on there. I know you. So, but I'm, if you don't know me, I'm chair of the security working group, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Brian Huggenbruch, which actually I would say we were an ex-colleague of mine from a few years ago, and I used to work for IBM and left IBM at the end of 2016. So I was saying to Brian, it's been a while since I last saw him. So it's nice to have you with us, Brian. I think this is your first time, isn't it, presenting
It
for
is.
GSE?
I've never had the opportunity before.
No, so a very warm welcome. Just a quick recap for everybody on the call. Don't forget your feedback for Mark's Nelson session if you attended that, or any of the sessions that you've attended over the last couple of days. Do that, and I'll remind you at the end of this. And this is session 8L for Brian's session. So without further ado, Brian, I'm going to hand over to you, and welcome to GSE.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Glad to be talking to you in some cases, for the very first time. Uh, it's always an opportunity, a pleasure to be able to talk about zVM security. And what I'd like to talk today about is the fundamentals of it. To talk about, the mindset that we get involved with when we talk about trying to secure a hypervisor layer. Try to highlight some of the distinctions in terms of securing zVM as opposed to something like ZOS. We will touch on all kinds of fun things like RACF on zVM, the concepts of cyber resiliency, some suggested practices. We never say mandates or even best practices is a little wibbly sometimes, but I'll do my best to point you in the right direction here. Now, I'm happy to take questions in line, so feel free to throw things into the chat. Jamie will, of course, bring me up short if if he feels I'm ignoring anything that's happening in the chat over there, but I do have an eye on the text going by. And as you can probably tell, I've had a few cups of coffee this morning. It's been one of those kinds of days. So if you find that I'm speaking a little bit too quickly, do wave your hands, post something in the chat, say, tell me to deploy parachute, slow down, and I will do my best to speak in a calmer and more moderated fashion. Security is just a passion of mine, which, if you don't know me, I've been working on it for a long time now. I am based out of Endicott, New York, which was IBM's site number one. That site has now closed, so now I technically report out of Poughkeepsie, although they haven't made me pick up and move my house yet, which is a relief to be sure. And for the past 24 years, I have been a zVM developer. So that's been coding in CP, TCP/IP, TLS, RACF, testing and virtual networking, and other portions of the product. And I've had the hat of zVM security champion for about 15 years now. And so that means I govern end-to-end security for the hypervisor layer, not just for RACF, but everything. And I'll explain what that means. Now, that does cover common criteria and FIPS validation processes. That covers end-to-end lifecycle management, sponsor user discussions, research around security, ease of use, all that fun stuff. And I do recognize a couple of the names on the attendee list, and so I think I may have spoken to a couple of you at least once or twice before, and I'm glad to do so again. The other hat I wear is Linux One Resiliency Lead. So you understand Linux One as a secondary brand to the IBM Z, which is optimized for running Linux-based workloads as opposed to IBM Z. It has a few, few distinctions to it. Most people focus on the orange stripe on the outside of the box. And as the lead for the entire platform, it's my fault that we have moved to 8 nines of availability. We worked on the math and got us to a good point where we were comfortable by padding out the number of nines by a few steps. And all that stuff ties rather nicely into the fun that is cyber resiliency and a lot of the discussions that we've been having in that space very recently. But over the past 15 years, the most common question I tend to receive is, okay, it's time. I'm gonna lock my zVM system. How do I secure it? And that is a fantastic question, and I wish people asked me that question more often. And Being a fan of the Socratic method, I love to answer questions with another question. What the heck are you doing with it? Because the needs and the mandates of securing one zVM system will shift if it's prod, if it's dev, if it's test, if it's something that you're using for hosting traditional Linux server web farm, if it's something that is actually CMS oriented and you have 491 human users hanging out, if you're building a small cloud for deployment for your own clients who may be taking advantages of the cloud services that you provide, if you're doing container-based workloads under OCP nowadays, all these things will move the needle on just what sort of security considerations you happen to have. But having a checklist is never a bad place to start. And if there's one place that I'd love to go for checklists, it is the PCI DSS, the payment card industry's data security standard. I have not actually checked to see if 4.0 or 4.1 have updated virtualization guidance yet. I probably should. But the gist of that is that you do need to consider the hypervisor as a threat vector. And that certainly pains me as a longtime fan of zVM, but it's the truth. You know, someone can seek to tunnel in to your ZOS guests or your Linux guests through the hypervisor layer, which means you need to make sure that no one crawls in through the basement window of your workload. And hypervisors introduce different kinds of attack surfaces. We do networking in a little bit different of a way than you might expect in terms of virtualized layer 2 and talking to physical switches. We are apt to have more than one kind of function or trust level inside of a single physical LPAR. And if you're not thinking about separation of duties and the retirement age of a virtual machine, when does it get to go home and spend time with its family? How good is your monitoring? All those things that build into the life cycle of a hypervisor, even before you get into the traditional confidentiality-based approaches to what you'd normally think of as security. How's your networking doing? How's your components doing? Do you have any kind of leakage in terms of your information that you're protecting there? And so I'll have recommendations and guidance all throughout. You never want to leave things as received from IBM. You always want to make sure it's going to meet spec. But at its most fundamental level, you just need to make sure that you are evaluating the technologies that you bring into your shop, that you understand their capabilities, and that you can make informed decisions based upon them. It's as easy as that. Now, that's all very well and good, but you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, that's great. Where do we start? Well, I have some ideas for you. Step one, set aside your 3270 session and go find the rules that you need to adhere to. That might sound obvious, but especially in a large enterprise, the sheer number of rules to which you must adhere is non-trivial. I say that speaking as someone who is an employee of a large organization, and the number of rules that we have is fun sometimes. And just because no one's told you about the rules does not mean that they're not there, and that doesn't mean that they won't slap you on the wrist or break out the security hammer if they feel that you've been in violation of them, right? Ignorance is no excuse of the laws. And in an ideal world, you start with the rules and then you build your system. Now, Mark mentioned in the last session that this is, of course, the 60th anniversary of the announcement of 360. And this means that there may be one or two systems out there which may predate the modern IT security rule set. Happens. So which means that you need to spend some time getting to know your system, know your technology, and know your requirements and start to move your hypervisor layer in a direction that's going to meet those things. Uh, Now, IBM is doing its best to help. We do undergo security certifications. zVM, in comparison to ZOS, does not evaluate quite as often. We actually do every other release. Now, bear in mind that zVM does what we call continuous delivery. So, you can always order the two most current releases of zVM at the same time. So despite the fact that zVM 7.3 is the most current, 7.2, which has been evaluated, is also still orderable. So if that's something that matters to you, you have that option. And secondly, given the rate at which certifications tend to expire, usually we're thinking like 5 to 6 year windows for things like the common criteria, for things like FIPS, and for other validations. Every other release seems to fit spec with us. Now, no one has ever come to me and said, "This is a problem for us. You need to evaluate every single release." If someone on in the chat wants to post whether or not that is in fact the case for them, I would love to hear it. I ask every opportunity I get. No one has ever taken me up on that challenge. But I keep asking because I never want to assume, because, there are sayings about people who make assumptions, right? Not mentioned on this slide is zVM 7.4. Now, since we've established a roughly 2 year cadence for the releasing of zVM releases, and the last release having come out in 2022, you can expect, and I think we've actually done a preview announce for zVM 7.4. I don't think there's an official announce date yet, but you can probably guess that it'll be out sometime toward the end of 3Q, maybe early 4Q, depending upon how the testing process goes. And because we'll be adding a new line, two new lines actually, to this chart, you can assume that we're going to evaluate that one, which is a good thing, right? Because the NIAP VPP, the virtualization protection profile, has up-leveled to include things like trusted update and validated boot, which ironically were not mandated for us at the time we did version 7.2. So we'll definitely want to make sure that we evaluate to that to make sure that everyone's happy with how we did secure IPL, or we will have done secure IPL because that's not out in the field yet. Similarly, 140-2 for FIPS has drifted away and is now replaced by the new hotness of 140-3. And we are having some fantastically lively discussions about how to make FIPS 140-3 work in our environment. Now, if you've been around the platform for a long time, you may look at virtualization technologies like zVM and think about LPAR and say, well, I mean, okay, well, that's an EAL5. Why you guys only an EAL4 plus? And I know that NIAP VPP doesn't have an EAL number at all. Uh, it's a different in philosophy. Consider that LPAR is meant purely for isolation of data and resources. It really focuses in terms of the profiles that it puts forth on control of direct access, elimination of covert channels, building of RBAC to the partition and hardware. They tend to ditch, the idea of shared resources between partition to partition, the idea of hypersockets. No, that's I mean, that you can control that appropriately, but if not managed, that's a covert channel. You don't want that in your LPAR, do you? In comparison, think of zVM as being meant for secure and scalable sharing. We all have slightly different checklists and security philosophies that we apply when we go through the common criteria evaluations. I'm sure Mark Nelson will back me up on that and have spoke at a little bit of length on the ZOS approach to those things. But we do adhere in zVM to that idea of multi-tenancy, the idea that you can host both Coca-Cola and Pepsi in the same logical partition, and they will not be able to speak to one another. Uh, Rather than ultimate isolation for a single secure enclave. And that's where zVM shines, is with being able to share these things. So you'll never see us go for an EAL5 for the hypervisor layer itself. And it's also worth noting that the common criteria, if you stack all these things together, we actually take the lowest number of a software stack. So zVM running in Prism actually has an aggregate assurance level of EAL4 plus. And I have never met anyone who took a look at our common criteria security target and said, I will do exactly that and nothing else. There will always be business ops reasons to try to do something a little bit different. And it could be something as simple as, oh, hey, I just bought a bunch of new Z16s. They're cheaper by the dozen. Thank you for your business. If we haven't evaluated the hardware as part of the zVM TOE, we aren't necessarily making any claims about that, but I've never seen anyone say we're not going to pick up new hardware because IBM didn't do a certification on the latest version of it. None of this is meant to disparage. I just want to give you some idea of context because if you're trying to know the rules, you really need to know the rules. You can't just look at that AL5 sticker on the side of the box, whether it's in green, blue, or orange, and say, okay, this baby can hold so many securities in it. We're done. That's not how it works. And certifications aren't enough, right? You will have your own regulations, internal policies that you need to meet. We'll do our best to help you map to those, but this is the starting point. And the next step on that journey is knowing your data. Certainly helping a lot of ZVMers upgrade their security policies over the years based upon IBM rule sets has taught me that knowing just what you're doing with those systems makes a big difference to the kinds of rules that you're going to be hit by. And, this should make sense. Fraud is a more restrictive world than test. Test should not have live client data. Uh, Fraud may have different resiliency and uptime requirements than test. Development is a strange, strange place. But knowing what it is that you want to accomplish and the kinds of things you need to control is going to help an awful lot in terms of just what things you need to turn on or not. I find, again, the PCI DSS, starting in version 3 at least, they actually asked you to draw diagrams of where all the cardholder information was actually flowing, which I thought was a fantastic concept and, as a visual learner, a great way to conceptualize that. And not something that's quite so simple in a virtualized environment, because remember, we do have guest mobility, and your cardholder data could be moving from guest to guest to LPAR to LPAR to CPC to CPC based upon your HA policies or just workload balancing. So keeping track of these things becomes a bit of a walnut shell game of where is your data today, and is it being appropriately protected where it landed? And the way you get there is by making sure you go through the defaults, make some updates. Uh, the hacker community love to talk about shrink wrap attacks. Something that's fresh out of the box that hasn't had a chance to be sanded down or worn in, and there's still a few things that are still open or were ripped open as part of the package unboxing process. So zVM development tends not to change its defaults as fast as I would like. And that may sound strange to hear from the person who literally owns the security process for zVM. But if there's one thing I hate more than poor security defaults, it's breaking clients who have live prod data, implementations, taking advantage of those. So we are updating. We do our best to keep things as current as we can. But if you have an old system configuration file lying around, it may not matter what our defaults are. You will have configured something perhaps 5, 10, 20 years ago. Uh, Go think about that and start toggling things. Like, what is the default privilege class for a basic workload? Do you have a specific operator privilege class defined? Like instead of class A, why not define a class O, or define particular virtual machines for it to be your alternate operator if some intern logs off the operator virtual machine? If you have a temporary disk, do you have a DoD level zeroization enabled for it? That is enabled by default as a 7.2, but if you have an old config file, that may not be the case. There are a bunch of default passwords in the zVM user directory. We do, as a 7.3, force you to change those at time of install or upgrade, which is good, but they are still there. We are working on cleaning those up. And again, if you have an older release of zVM, or if something we haven't addressed yet is default mini disk passwords, things that you may need to go rearrange. And certainly zVM provides a lot of virtual machines out of the box that, depending upon the kinds of things you're doing, you may or may not need. And think about SMAPI, for example, our API interface for things like IBM Cloud Infrastructure Center. If you're not using SMAPI, go in and no log all those virtual machines. Make it so that those virtual machines do not exist in any kind of context so that no one can try to start them and take advantage of privileged operational authority just because nobody was paying attention to it. So challenge your own assumptions based upon the configuration. Don't, as much as I love to push the needle toward initial secure state right out of the box, and we're moving it as fast as we can, there's always going to be an opportunity to go past us. Now, there are a lot of virtual machines that still have their own distinct passwords in the CP user directory. They probably should not. That's not because in the olden days you didn't necessarily need them, but a virtual machine is not on the payroll. They cannot be fired if there's a breach or be penalized in any fashion. Management always takes, they think the worst of the humans rather than the machines sometimes. So you really want to make sure that it's your humans that have passwords rather than the virtual machines. You do want to make sure that you're not sharing passwords amongst administrators. Operator is a commonly used virtual machine. You do need to separate that out. Your passwords should be socially distanced, and I don't just mean by putting it on a post-it note that's a meter and a half away. We did start cleaning up the default user directory, but A, we're not done. And B, that doesn't impact your systems. If you have previously installed zVM, we're not going to mess with what you've done. Okay. Frankly, we don't want you to be surprised. We follow the law of least astonishment and, and then provide a lot of warnings on top of that, which means that crack open your user directory sometime. Take a look. See if there's anything in there that should be log on by only or auto log only, something that does not have a password but can be started, or something that can be shared in a manner that is reasonably protected and relies on a human user's password rather than having a technical user have a password of their own. Log on by only, for the record, will correspond to the RecF surrogate class, which will come up in just a moment. So take a look, give passwords to your humans, and revoke the humans when pertinent. I will say in this context, I'm going to say passwords when I mean both passwords and passphrases. I know that there is a RACF distinction between those two, but from a broad perspective, please assume I mean both. Understanding the concept of least privilege inside of zVM is a neat thing. We love for the hypervisor kernel to be able to do a lot of work, and we have what are called service virtual machines, which will take advantage of of 6 of the 7 roles that we define out of the box for the product in order to get work done, right? Classes A through G, where A through F are for privileged users. Class G is defined for CMS general users, and it was created all the way back in 1984, which is not longer than I've been alive, but it's up there. And there are actually 60 Class G commands today, not including all the queries and the set commands that you can do under zVM. If you are IPLing Linux, you only need 15 of them to get started. You may need a few more in order to do some work, depending, but you don't need them all. I also tend to see occasionally that folks will give out an entire privilege class just for one command, which gives me the heebie-jeebies. Class C, for example, of the system programmer, contains both the for and the send commands, which are fantastic for telling another virtual machine what they need to go do, right? Class C also contains the store host command, which allows your user to change active host memory, which means that congratulations, Neo, you now control the matrix. You can do anything you want. It's all in the power of your imagination. Uh, so you really want to control that command. Similarly, I see folks granting out entire privilege classes for things that just need to happen at startup. And there is actually a command statement in the CP user directory that you can use to issue, say, set vSwitch grant, for example, to cause a virtual machine to be authorized to join a network, and then let them be class G without having to have granted them class B just for setup purposes. Again, we tend not to change the privilege classes as often as I would like. And anytime IBM creates a new CP command, we put them in A through G, right? That's those are our bit buckets for dumping these things. So you can define for either your operating systems or for your human administrators uh, roles and RBAC policy that maps to the kind of workload that you're trying to accomplish. So if you wanted to make Class L for Linux guests, or Class P for programmers, Class S exclusively for the shutdown command, that's a thing that you can accomplish. You can either enable or disable the capacity for a virtual machine to change their own privilege class. That's an option in the system config. Anyone who's Class C can change anything that they want in terms of authority. Anyone who exists can remove authorities from themselves, which may not seem like a lot, but even class any kinds of commands, we don't want cloud-based virtual machines to mess with their own capabilities, just because that might start to muck about with service providers, SLAs, and the like. So think about turning that on or off depending. Think about modifying the commands. Build your own privilege classes, build your own RBAC based upon the kinds of capacities that you want to be able to accomplish, right? So again, understanding the workload, what you want to accomplish with it, will let you set a policy that is a lot more flexible than what IBM will provide out of the box and hew a lot more closely to the kinds of things that you actually want to get done. zVM does not enable TLS by default. It should, it doesn't. We're working on it. If your rules, remember number one, mandate that administrative access to systems must be encrypted, then you need to go turn on TLS for your TCP/IP suite. This is independent of anything that you do for the guests. I'm talking about TLS protection of the CP logon logo screen, 3270 green screen, because your hypervisor is a point of entry into your broader workload. And certainly an authorized virtual machine can have all kinds of fun looking at client data if you let it. So, I mean, if your rules for some reason did not ask you to do that, it's still frankly a good idea. There are very few rules that will let you get away with stuff in the clear these days, but if you wanted to transfer data in the clear, then it can be unobserved. And that means that things like reused passwords on the part of your humans might be exposed and might try to be applied to your prod systems. And we're hitting the point where new technology that IBM ships for zVM actually requires that TLS be configured. I'm thinking here of GetShopZ, which is the direct-to-host service transfer mechanism. If you wanted MFA for IBM Z, then you need to have TLS enabled so that RACF and the MFA server can speak securely to one another. I do have an entire presentation that covers TLS, so I'm not going to get into the guts of it here. It has been recorded a few times, so that video is out there, and of course, happy to answer questions that should anyone come and find me. But we are providing something that will help to meet your cryptographic policy needs for data in flight, even for the hypervisor layer. We are working on making cert management easier. Remember, we don't have RACD cert on zVM, so it's a slightly different mindset in terms of dealing with these things. And I do expect that the goal will be to certify 7.4 to FIPS 140-3 for a slightly more modern set of compliance. And I just like to point out that I got to slide 20 before I really before I got to rack F in any kind of meaningful point. And I get a lot of people who look at zVM security and say, well, that's just rack F. No, it really isn't. RACF is a mandatory component. Technically, yes, you only enable it if it's needed. But I have yet to see a modern IT rule, where by modern I mean 2003, where RACF or another security manager is not a requirement for running your system. I'm going to say RACF a whole bunch. I am aware that there are other ESMs out there, and if you have one that meets your company's security policy, I'm cool with it. I'm not going to judge. That's fine. You do what's appropriate for your security policy and your company's pocketbook. But I'm going to talk about RACF, and there's a couple of reasons why. A, I develop RACF, so I'm fond of it. B, Mark Nelson's watching me, so I'm morally obligated to support RACF because, yay. And C, it is actually a mandatory component of our common criteria evaluations. We do not evaluate zVM without RACF turned on and enabled. It simply just doesn't exist, that kind of a mindset. So if you want a common criteria certified implementation related to zVM, you have to have RACF, and there are no validation statements related to the other ESMs out on the market. And you get, for the price of RACF, better auditing, actual encryption of passwords and phrases, better control of privileged commands, extensibility of security policy through a single system image, controls on password policies, access rights, security management. We do not allow you to turn on MFA unless you have an ESM installed and enabled. And if you're hoping for multi-tenancy, if you're leaning toward that cloud service provider model, then security labeling and zoning within a single LPAR only happens if you happen to have RACF enabled. I don't believe any of the other ESMs give you those kinds of options. Now, I get a lot of complaints about this, and maybe that's just because I'm a zVM guy. I don't know if anyone ever complains to Mark Nelson about this, but yeah, people will say, I have to turn on security, but we've only got the one guy, right? And I understand that turning on all of security just for one human may seem like a lot, but go back and check your rules. Did we have a rule in your company's security policies that said, okay, we need to control all human users except Mark Nelson because we know he's cool and we love the way that he handles his motorcycle journeys and documents all that stuff. So, you know what? If it's Mark, it's fine. If it's everybody else, turn on RACF. I've never seen that ever happen, frankly. And it ignores the fact that that one person is in an odd way a single point of failure. Because if you bribe Mark in dollars or pounds or Dogecoins or whatever your currency du jour is, you need to be able to track the damage that he might do to your system. And I know Mark, he'll do some damage to your system if you let him. I once met somebody who told an auditor that yes, they have RACF installed, and the auditor checked the box, and they went off on their merry way. Um, that person did not actually have RACF enabled; they just had it installed. Now, I appreciate sticking to the letter of the law when talking to auditors, but that is a fast way to get yourself into a whole lot of trouble. That kind of a mindset. Just because the auditing question is not perhaps as accurate as it could be, think about your life choices in that sense. And I once met a set of folks who told me that we have an access control policy. The three of us, we sit in a room together, and if one of us does anything stupid, the other two slap them upside the head. Which, at first I thought was fantastic, but then I thought about it, and I thought, you can't audit bruises. That doesn't take collusion into account. And if the three of them decide that they're done and just lock up your system and walk out and leave as a form of strike, how do you get your system back in that case? So think about this and go back to your rule set and consider whether or not humans humans can be trusted in that sense. Now, I will certainly acknowledge that configuring RACF can be a fun time sometimes. Now, there are ways that IBM can help with that. Lab-based services and similar organizations can help you get set up. There are programs that can help with that. zSecure for RACF VM in 2022 dropped version 2.5.1. So they sent out a lot of new function out into the world to help you manage RACF on zVM. And there are actually ways that you can help us. We do actually invite clients to come talk to what we call the VM Council on a monthly basis, where you can sign up to be sponsor users to express pain points, to help us see the things that we're not seeing. So there are ways to get involved that if you have the mental bandwidth and the legal permission to talk about these things, it can do an awful lot to help us help you. Again, zSecure, if you happen to have it, great. And if you've upgraded, you know that you have SIEM integration and an SMF cache server and support for MFA, and even support for RACF databases residing on SCSI volumes of all things, along with a whole host of other things. Do check out that announcement if you don't have zSecure, because there's a lot of things that it can offer you. Now, Mark mentioned this in his presentation an hour and change ago, but I'll just emphasize that we did disable the sharing of RACF databases between zVM and ZOS. And the reason we did this, Mark said that the zVM folks have perfectly valid reasons. And here's my perfectly valid reason. ZOS and zVM often have different mindsets about what security is, and the rules that they need to follow will be slightly different. And so, if you happen to have a distinct set of humans managing one versus the other, you have to worry about A, collision of namespace, and B, system administrators working on a database to opposite ends. You don't want your ZOS person to shoot the zVM folks in the foot by changing security policy and accidentally blocking somebody out or breaking prod workload on a zVM system, right? And so I will emphasize that we have been we have been asking nicely and clearing our throat and say, you really shouldn't be doing that for, I want to say, about 18 years now, which by IBM standards is pretty good in terms of hemming and hawing and letting you migrate on your own terms. But yeah, we're at the point where okay, that's it, it's done. What I'll tack on to that is that the tools will actually still work against either form of database, right? So if you have both ZOS and zVM, and a lot of my clients do, you can still take the RACF VM database and unload it, write reports against it, do repair on it, and run other utilities against it, and it will still operate in the same fashion. The structure is still the same. That we've just made sure that you cannot have a running database attached to the distinct kinds of systems at the same time. For all I care, you can you can take the ZOS RACF database, uh, rack UT 200 it, and then send a copy over to zVM, color code it so it runs on zVM and be off again. If that's what you need to do, fine. Just no more sharing. That's it. And there's one of those few cases where sharing does not mean caring on zVM. Uh, do explore MFA. Again, this will be relative to the rules that you have to follow. It may be slightly more distinct and granular based upon the type of environment and the type of information you have on your zVM systems. We do understand passwords to be a technology that can be compromised, either by the theft of post-it notes or the fact that humans are not, by their nature, perfect entropy machines. You know, although, speaking as the father of a 3-year-old, there are some days, right? Um, humans are going to reuse passwords or rotate them or use something fairly similar or follow patterns because we are creatures who create patterns. And so the use of a second authentication factor, whether it's something that you have or something that you are, can strengthen your system against compromise, right? This will require a new product. This is the IBM Z multi-factor authentication product. And if you have ZOS, you're already familiar with this, but it's not exactly the same product. It's the same ordering mechanism, but as you go to order it, you'll find a fork in the road where you can download either the ZOS version or the zVM version, which runs inside of a Linux guest. And you want the latter. And if you're not a ZOS person, you go out and try to follow all along with all this stuff, and you see ZOS, don't panic. It's okay. You'll get to the ISO soon enough. Now, this has been out for a little while now. I did record a YouTube video for the VM workshop some time ago about prepping your systems for MFA, and all that still holds. We've just updated the numbers on the releases mostly at this point. I will say that MFA version 2.3 does introduce a lot of stability enhancements for the Linux-hosted MFA server. So if you have MFA, do go ahead and look at upgrading. If you don't have it, see if you need it, and then make the leap to version 2.3 directly. And if you are having a fun time with service, I do encourage you, rather than get Z, to go check out Service Link instead, because they'll get the updated files for the MFA server a whole lot faster than GetShopZ will. This may seem obvious, but encrypt your data. Know where it is, know where it's moving, know what you're doing with it, and encrypt it when it's resident in memory. So think things like dataset encryption for ZOS or a dmcrypt for Linux. Encrypt your RACF database for your passwords and passphrases, of course. Turn on encrypted paging for zVM when you're running on a Z14 or later. Take advantage of the DS8000 family's storage encryption. Occasionally, some people come to me and say, well, am I encrypting things twice, 3 times? And I look at them and I say, well, maybe. What's the problem? You know, you want to make sure it's encrypted in all the places it can be. And if we learned anything from the Z14 launch of pervasive encryption, it's that pervasive encryption is not so much a technology, it's a lifestyle choice. And choosing to encrypt in as many places as possible means knowing the technologies and knowing how to deal with them. If you're running zVM, you're probably going to be leaning more on a layer 2 mode virtual switch than you are layer 3. And I'm going to assume here that either everyone understands the OSI model of networking, or if you don't, you're going to pause this recording later and go back and do some quick Googling and then come back and watch the rest of this. The net is that since you're dealing with Ethernet connections, we're assuming that the guest OSs will be encrypting things as they leave the virtual machine. What you want to do at layer 2 is make sure that virtual traffic is separated. The virtual switch will do some of this on its own, but by default, it'll do what we call a hairpin turn at the OSA card if you're communicating with inside a single logical partition. So if you need to have a little bit more separation of your virtual networks at that level, do consider turning on OSA port isolation if you need to force traffic in one door rather particularly. Turn on VEPA mode for the virtual switch if you need to enforce that traffic goes all the way out to a physical switch and a firewall before it undergoes a security decision and gets routed elsewhere. Yeah, you may ask yourself on occasion, okay, well, what do we do for a firewall on zVM? You can deploy a firewall inside a Linux guest if you're so inclined, and I see folks put them, on just inside of an isolated OSA port just to filter traffic before it goes off and routes things. But we find that more often the physical switch and the firewalls there will be more than fine for what you want to accomplish. And burning the MIPS by putting a firewall on zVM itself doesn't make a ton of sense. So, but do what makes most sense for you. Do make sure you double check your defaults. go through and double check all the older networking technologies. Think IUCV, think APPC, think hypersockets. If you need to control hypersockets, have you considered the hypersockets bridge and attaching a hypersocket connection directly to the zVM virtual switch? Um, and think about guest mobility, which exists inside of a single system image and the relocation of live memory. That will be transmitted via CTC, but you need to think about, are there any regulations or relocation of guests onto another CPC? Is it moving, at a metro level? Are you moving it to another country? Uh, are there any export controls on your virtual machine, weirdly, that you need to worry about? So go update that diagram you have about how your data is flowing and spend some time with it. But yeah, just go through and double check your defaults. Make sure that you turn off the ability to create a guest LAN by default. Make sure that you're using directory network authorization if you're not already. For once, we made networking easier on zVM in terms of VLAN management. And so if you're not using those controls, you're actually missing out. Your RACF will back you up on that. And indeed, RPI Direct will translate what's in your user directory and DNA into pure RACF policy to back you up on that. But if you're not actually controlling the VM LAN class, maybe you care, maybe you don't, but you might need it for auditing. So again, that whole understanding your rules thing and understanding exactly what you need is going to matter a whole lot. Uh, do you have a recovery plan? IBM certainly spends an awful lot of time talking about the identify and protect sections of the NIST cyber resiliency framework, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But sometimes you get sick and you need to cure things back to life, and sometimes bad things happen to good systems. It's a shame, but it does happen. So do bear in mind that availability is one of the three cornerstones of the CIA triad. And think about it. Are you taking backups? Are those backups protected? Do those backups include your RACF database? Do they include your key material for TLS connections? Do you have the bandwidth to fail over running workloads so that you don't drop any SLAs or meet any kind of availability requirements in terms of the workload that you provide? Um, Now, this is a heck of a diagram, and I don't expect you to understand this in 90 seconds. But as part of my other job, 8 nines now. And so if you configure zVM the right way, this entire setup is designed to have, what is it, 314 milliseconds of downtime per year on average. And we certainly know clients who have been running the same Linux guest for years and years and years, far longer than their zVM systems have been up, right? Because you just move a Linux guest from one area to another, do service on zVM, bring things back up, and rebalance. This does lean on things like GDPS and Operations Manager, occasionally Backup and Restore Manager, and depending upon your workload, may take advantage of things at your control plane for either cloud-based environments or containerization type stuff. So bear in mind the things that you're trying to accomplish and then go from there. Gather some proof. Because if a security event isn't audited, it's like a tree falling in the forest, right? And that means understanding where are your audit logs going? Are they heading to an SIEM? What's your retention policy? The other side of the coin for that is your system configured for compliance to whatever standard you need to meet. Was it yesterday? Will it be tomorrow? In zVM 7.3, we introduced this thing called the compliance utility. The intent with this is to integrate it at some point into the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center, ZSCC. ZSCC itself is not there yet, but the compliance utility does have both a command line version as well as a systems management API that you can program to today, such that we track 210 key value pairs for the all the different places you could be doing something security relevant on zVM, as many as we can think of. It is in fact extensible so that if you find more and you don't want to wait for IBM to ship an update, go ahead and code it. If you're a vendor and want your product to be included, go ahead and code it and then submit an AHA or an idea or whatever, however IBM gets its requirements today. We do take requests. So that is out now for 7.3, and we've actually had cases where it's helped both internal testing understand that they didn't upgrade their systems properly, and that there was a mixed level in between CP and RACF testing between 7.3 and 7.4, because we check for those kinds of things to make sure that everything's on a common level and we track it. We check to make sure that your TLS policy is using only the good kinds of crypto and not all the stuff we keep around for legacy reasons. We don't do a whole lot of analysis with the compliance utility because, again, the intent was ZSCC, but because we're dropping either command line output or flat files that can be examined and diffed, you can actually tell if something has changed for day to day. And if something has changed, you can go digging and make sure that based upon the PCIS DSS dirty dozen target you were trying to hit, you have exactly what changed. You can figure out what went wrong, whether it was something that meant to happen or if somebody did something awry. And then finally, set a timer because we can't just look at all this and say, okay, I did security. I'm all done. We're set. We're fine. No, that never works. So revisit those decisions. I don't know how often is going to make sense for you. I suspect your security people will. But the security landscape does change fairly often, and yesterday's secure enough is tomorrow's broken, unfortunately. And that is true even on IBM Z and IBM Linux One. If you're not registered for things like the IBM Z security portal, I highly encourage you to be, because those are the kinds of areas that will help you determine if you are keeping pace. So very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, the suggested practices: do appropriate identity management, focus on the humans, technical users as you need to, and that does mean RACF, MFA, LDAP if it's pertinent, log on by in the surrogate class, really vital for all those shops where you have only one or two sysprogs and dozens of virtual machines, and audit your humans. You need to. Uh, Double check your authorization and your least privileges. RACF will give you a lot of stuff out of the box you can control. You may not need to control it all. So double check that against the kinds of workloads that you're trying to run, and make sure that you have appropriate separation of authorization between admins. Encrypt your data. That's a no-brainer. That means in flight. That means in active memory. That means for your guests. That means for tape. That means for storage. And yes, we can help you reconfigure your crypto resources that are attached to zVM. So if you need help with that, we can be flexible on that. Um, Mark mentioned validated boot. I will say for zVM, use GetShopZ for service, because that is what allows you to validate the digital signatures on packages coming from IBM. Validate your guests on an IBM Z16 using list-directed IPL. That's the fancy term for secure boot or validated boot. You can validated boot a ZOS guest under zVM. It will just complain because there's no virtual flash memory and say that it failed the audit and then come up in a secure boot fashion anyway. So don't listen to ZOS complaining. It's okay. It's safe. Just tell the auditors not to panic if they see it complaining. And then diff your compliance data, because you want to make sure that your config is not changing. You don't see host secure boot on here yet. It is a requirement for the 7.4 common criteria evaluation. So even though you don't see the technology there today, I suspect you will see it there tomorrow. Take backups, have a DR plan, test a DR plan, have redundant storage. Uh, you may hear about CyberVault. CyberVault, like pervasive encryption, is a lifestyle choice rather than a product, and it is meant to help with DFIR and recovery. And it does exist for Linux One. Don't ignore it just because it's a ZOS thing and think that, oh well, that doesn't exist for zVM. It's there. Use it, please. And then audit, audit, and I don't really need to say more than that. So that actually brings me to the end of my prepared remarks. I know we only have a couple minutes left, and I have not seen anyone say anything. And I don't know if it's because I don't have any chocolate handy, or if it is because the last session of the day, or if because I was a sterling presenter and I managed to answer every single question you possibly could have had.
The latter, Brian, the latter,
Uh-huh.
of course, yes.
I totally believe that. So let me say though, I know we went through that fast. If you want a hands-on approach to everything I just covered, we have a red book for that, and it was updated in 2023 at the tail end there. And I see keynote speaker Mark Nelson was involved with that. So I know it's very fine print. You'll have to squint, but his name is on there, and that means it's cool and hip and whatnot. I can't speak to motorcycle metaphors being in the book or not, but you'll have to go and read to find out. So I'm actually going to take a sec after 57 minutes of talking and shut up here and see if anybody has any questions.
Any questions for Brian? You can unmute your line if you like, or you can post a question in the chat. I have a question. I always have a question for my
Hmm.
presenters. I always save one up, but I'll just give everyone a second or two more. Okay, so couple of questions then. So
Hmm.
for we were in the last session, Mark's session, we were talking about the CIS benchmarks. Is there
Hmm.
anything for zVM at the moment? I couldn't see anything. I saw there was a Red Hat kind of control sheet for Linux on Z, but I
Hmm.
didn't see anything specific for zVM. Is that in the
Yeah, so I will admit that there's not. It's on the list that actually first on our list is updating the dissystig for zVM, which is a few years old and talks about VM secure rather than RACF. So that's on our list to update first, and then I figure we'll take that, translate that out to a CIS benchmark, and then we'll feed both of those things into the ZSCC so that it can track all of those things all at once. But
mm,
we understand that everybody has a lot of different rules they need to adhere to, and we're doing our best to turn them into checklists because uh, we're running out of the days where you can just sit down with a bunch of guidelines and make informed decisions and not just be, okay, quick, tell me, I have 2 seconds. Is it secret? Is it safe? Um, yeah, we're working on it, and I suspect I'll put something on the VM security webpage as soon as it's out there.
So, Brian, as you're looking for input into those into the CIS benchmarks, the STIGs were a starting point, but we also took a lot of input from vendor
Hmm.
recommendations that we had found, internal recommendations. There's a lot of good sources out there,
Hmm.
and in fact, I hope to see some of what you have in here to
hmm.
be part of them.
Well, if I'm the person who starts writing it, I suspect I know a guy, but but yeah, no, I don't think
Yeah,
it's just going to be my view of security. It can't be.
right.
Very good. And out of interest, these days, what sort of kind of workload is used for ZVM? Is it kind of a mixed bag, would you say, or is it kind of is there a kind of a weighting?
Well, so the primary workload we tend to see is Linux based and centered around Oracle database workloads. That's kind of
Okay.
our bread and butter. And you see other folks doing other things with it, whether it's exploration into OpenShift, for example. We do have some folks who run ZOS, usually more as a test bed rather than actual workload, because there are some fun things trying to do sysplex under zVM. But there's still plenty of folks running ZOS under zVM today at VSE. For anyone who knows and loves that platform, still requires zVM, so that's still out there and floating around. But it's usually Linux, it's usually Oracle, and you know, a lot of areas in finance, banking, world governments, insurance, and you know, all the usual suspects in that sense.
Yeah, that's good to know. All right, Brian. Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. It's been a while since I've actually looked at zVM, so it's a good sort of refresher for me, as it were. And I'm very pleased that you are. I know this is a bit controversial, probably for some sites. You are separating, you know, that requirement to have a separate
Mm.
RACF database between. You can't share between ZOS and zVM.
Mm.
As we always say, security zones,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
you shouldn't mix them. And I mean, yes, you see some sites still sharing in ZOS world development with production systems with the same RACF database. It's like, think security zones.
Yep, yep.
Enough said on that. But no, thank you very much. And for your first session at GSE as well, congratulations. You survived the first hour.
Thank you. I hope to survive a second someday.
Yes, indeed.
And of course, if anybody has any feedback for me, you know, I can help you pick out numbers, of course, but you know, actual feedback is even more appreciated on my side. And even if it's something as if you should have given this presentation to Mark Nelson to do, I'll take that.
Yeah, so that's on that note. So
No. No.
on that note, so that question there, and you see the sample feedback that Brian's put on his slide, number 2, the best answer. This is a classic mistake people make on this one. How to answer this? It's actually 5 is the best answer, because if you read the answers, number 1 is too short, and number 9 is too long. But if you want to give high scores, then from question 3 onwards, then you can put like 8s and 9. As my garage always says when I go to pick up my car, we only like 9s and 10s in the survey for feedback. So that's the weighting. So just always remember that about question 2. So yeah, don't forget to leave feedback. It's very important for Brian or all of our presenters. You know, you give feedback for. And also for you, for your CPE certificate, remember that when you go to My GSE and generate your CPE certificate, that's generated automatically based on feedback that you've given for sessions that you have actually attended. So do that. And if you've got a backlog, the survey, by the way, I mean, ideally get this done and in, you know, by the end of tomorrow, because then you know, that counts also towards Best Speaker awards as well. So get it done when you can. So that's the last session of the day. There are no more sessions after for today, but we do start up again tomorrow for day 3 of the conference, and we'll be on air from 9 o'clock in the morning. That's 9 o'clock UK time, 4 a.m. for Mr. Nelson and for Brian. So do join us for that. And in the securities track, we've got a full back-to-back day actually of sessions, and the first is around, we've heard a bit snippets about DORA today, so we're going to have the auditor Deloitte will be coming to present about it, to give their take on DORA from a mainframe standpoint. So that should be really interesting.
I might wake up for that.
You might want to play on catch up. Yeah. On demand. Yep. But thanks again once, Brian. It's lovely to see you again, and hopefully we'll see you soon at GSE. And have a wonderful evening, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow morning bright and early.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Nicely done, Brian. Good session.
Yeah, nicely done.
Thank
Well
you.
done. Thank you.